I tell you what, Christopher Nolan, he is pretty brilliant, but super strange. I still don't know what Tenet is all about. And part of it is because I couldn't hear it. So maybe that's part of the problem. But...
It's true. It's hard to recommend that movie. It's actually one of my favorites, and one of my co-hosts severely disagrees with me on that. But I love the music because it's about the only thing you can hear. You need to watch it with subtitles. Their thick accents, their masks, the loud music. It's still an interesting concept to me. And
Tom Hardy's Bane would have fit right in with that movie.
True.
Hello there.
Don't have a good day. Have a great day.
Talk to me, Goose.
I'm gonna steal the Declaration of Independence.
Why so serious? World.
I could do this all day.
Are you watching closely?
Welcome, everybody, to the One-Eyed Film Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Mossberg, and today I am honored to have Paul Asay with me today from Focus on the Family's Plugged In to talk with me about parenting, even though I'm not a parent yet. I am very blessed, I suppose, that we got this connection, that I reached out to Plugged In, and that you were willing to come on and talk to us a little bit about what you do at Plugged In, what Plugged In's perspective is on their whole mission of making sure parents are aware of what's coming out. Even more than movies, you guys do websites, YouTubers, music, video games. It's really impressive.
Man, we do almost everything, right? If it's in the entertainment sphere, we have some sort of review, hopefully, on it. Most things that people would be interested in. And yeah, you kind of nailed it. You know, we're probably best known for our movies, but we do a lot of TV. We do books. We do music. We do video games. YouTube channels. So we talk a little bit about technology as well. So we really try to hit a lot of, I guess, pain points that parents have. And we do have a broader audience than that. But I would say for the most part, a lot of people who come are looking for stuff that's going to be good for their kids.
Well, and I still come to Plugged In often to kind of get an overview of a movie before I go see it. I think it's still helpful, even if it's geared towards, you know, making sure the kids are okay to see it, but it still lets you know with perspective what a movie is going to be like. So there's a website that I'm sure you're familiar with. It's Kids in Mind, and it's pretty bullet point things that are in the movie, and it doesn't really give the Christian worldview of it. And you guys write that into your reviews. You even make sure that the expletives of Jesus's name are listed out and numbered so that you're aware of that, because I don't know that Kids in Mind does that. But that's one plus side to Plugged In, is you put a little bit more effort into it for the audience that you're making it for, which is hopefully people who use Focus on the Family's curriculum a lot and just go to Plugged In for all that type of stuff.
Yeah. We try. That's for sure. We try.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, what's your favorite movie of all time? Just to kind of get an idea for who you are. And as you have a little bit more of experience with movies than I do, a couple more years on me, I want to hear what you think.
Just a couple.
Yes.
Man, you know, that is always a dangerous question to ask a movie reviewer, because immediately I start thinking about, so what movies did I enjoy, or what movies do I think are the best? You know, because sometimes they're very different things. Like, I think maybe the best movie that I have seen, the one that stuck with me the longest, might be Schindler's List. You know, but it's not a movie that I would go to repeatedly. You know, I really have a great appreciation for the art. I have a great appreciation for what the movie was trying to say, but it's not a movie that I would, you know, it's a hard movie to sit through. You know, and probably along the same lines would be a movie like Silence, which came out, I think, in 2016. Martin Scorsese, beautiful movie, made about $2 at the box office, because it was a hard movie to watch. But it involves these Jesuit missionaries who come to Japan in the 1600s, and just sort of the persecution they dealt with, the idea of dealing with their faith in such a hostile culture to it. I thought it was just fascinating, and so much of that movie has stuck with me. But it's not a movie that I'm gonna just pop in and say, you know what, I have a free Friday night, I'm gonna watch Silence. True. So for that movie, I would probably say I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan. Loved Fellowship of the Rings. Old school. I think Raiders of the Lost Ark is one of the coolest movies I can think of. And yeah, so those would probably be my choice. I also have a really soft spot for The Princess Bride.
Yes, I know a few people who are going to like hearing that. You brought up Lord of the Rings, and that's kind of where I wanted to start really into the meat of this, is the inspiration for this episode and why I reached out to Plugged In the first place. We had a section, a video clip of the Hobbit episode, I believe, with my sister and Will. It was Annika, my sister, saying that she wishes that there was a kid's version of The Hobbit similar to the book and not the kind of reflection of the Lord of the Rings that we got 10 years ago now with the Peter Jackson Hobbit trilogy, which again, we had a lot of conversation about why was it so long? Why did they have to make it into 3 movies instead of
I have
really
so
short?
many thoughts on that. So many thoughts.
And she said she wishes that there was a kid's version. And a lot of people got upset at that because they said, well, I was watching Lord of the Rings at 7, or I was watching Terminator with my dad when I was 8. I was like, okay, first off, that's a logical fallacy saying that because your experience did one thing that it's objectively true. It's not. You can't follow that logic. But then I sort of brought it up to you when we were emailing back and forth. And you said that with the re-releases of The Lord of the Rings, you marked, or not you specifically, maybe you aided in that, but you have the light, medium, heavy ratings for movies, and you had kids as heavy, like very heavily. I don't know what other word you pair with that. Heavily discourage. Heavy warning.
So we typically say it's like a green, yellow, red cautionary color scale, I guess you would call it. And yeah, so it would be heavy caution. It's not telling parents that they can't take or they shouldn't take their kids to it, but it is a sign that they really need to be cautious about it, because there are some elements within, and like I just said, I have nothing against Lord of the Rings. I think it's a fantastic series. I love the series. I think that it has so many great messages, so many cool elements to it. I think the Balrog is still one of the coolest monsters that I've ever seen on screen. But and there you go. Right there, you have sort of a cautionary element that probably parents should think about, because the Balrog was pretty intense. That whole Balrog scene, and watching Gandalf, spoiler alert, watching Gandalf fall to what appears to be his doom at that point, it can impact kids, and it can cause issues for them. It can give them nightmares. This is not saying that it will. Every kid is so different. And so that's why we kind of leave it up to the parents to choose. But I know when I was a little kid and I was reading these books, I tell you what, those ring wraiths, they popped up in my nightmares more than once. So you never know exactly how these things are going to affect their kids.
Yeah. What is Plugged In's approach? Probably, I don't know if you have some spiel that you have to memorize in order to work at Plugged In, or if you have formed some of it even. What is Plugged In's approach to suggesting or discouraging movies for families while still allowing parents to have freedom to choose? Because you work for Focus on the Family, so you're going to have a lot of information, a lot of suggestions in your ministry, where it's not rules that Focus on the Family thinks you need to follow if you're going to have a successful family. How does that play out for you guys?
So we really, at Plugged In, we try to take a very open view of what we review, but we also take a very cautionary view of it. And I know that seems a little bit counterintuitive, but essentially what we try to do at Plugged In is we try to give parents all the information that they can possibly need to know, because we have such a wide range of readers. We have 20 somethings who come for their own purposes. We have teens who are trying to argue with their parents about whether they can see a movie or not. And then we have a lot of parents who come and want to know what's good for their 3-year-old, what's good for their 7-year-old, what's good for their 12-year-old. And they range really from extremely, extremely conservative parents to parents who are much more, I guess, closer to the culture, I guess you could say. So they really run the gamut, and we try to give as much information as we can for all of these different people. So, and that can make some people, wonder what the heck we're doing, because we would actually probably say, hey, this movie might have a heck in it. And, there's probably a lot of people that would say, why are you listing that? But there are, for some parents, that's an issue. And so what we do is we tabulate as much as we can. We talk about how much violence you might see in a movie, the spiritual elements that you might come across, drug use, profanity, if the movie is getting sexual or whatnot. These are all elements that we sort of try to tabulate as best as we can, and then just lay out all the facts for our readers. And then hopefully they can sort of decide for themselves what is appropriate for them, what is appropriate for their kids. I'll be completely honest with you. In a lot of ways, I wish we could do away with the color ratings. I wish we could do away. We sometimes, when we do radio interviews, we have numerical ratings, but those are shortcuts that our readers appreciate, our users appreciate, but they can be misleading because every child is different. Every family is different. And so it makes me feel like we're trying to tell parents what is good for their kids when that's really not our purpose at all.
Yeah. Should parents, and again, that's a thing where like can't tell every parent to do this, but should parents share more intense movies with their kids to expose them to the real world or keep them innocent for as long as possible? I don't know if this is going to be an answer from Paul Asay or from the editor at Plugged In who has to say a certain thing.
Yeah, this is a tricky one, and I think that it's a really great question. And I guess I would give sort of a twofold answer. I think that when we are parents, we do try to protect our kids as much as possible. We try to guide their choices. We try to help them along the way and protect their innocence as long as we can. Right? There's so much gunk in the world that they're going to have to deal with. And I think as parents, it's our sort of knee jerk to protect them as long as we can. And the other thing that I'll mention that goes alongside this is at Plugged In, we really do believe that what we watch, what we listen to, what we play can impact us in ways that we don't even necessarily know it at the time. You know, there's a lot of studies that talk about desensitization that can happen through the course of movies. We can sort of learn to accept things that maybe we were taught not to accept the more exposed we are to media. So I think that there is an element of protection that we as parents kind of need to lean into. That said, I'm also a big proponent of letting kids skin their knees every once in a while, run around and experience things. And sometimes I think that watching a movie that might scare them a little bit, watching a movie that has some deeper elements to it, that can be a part of the growing up process too. You know, I remember very distinctly when I was a kid, movies that scared me or movies that bothered me, or, you know, the first R-rated movie I saw. You know, these are sort of landmarks in kids' lives. And I think that the key when we're talking about that, like if you as a parent want to take your kid to something that might be a little bit old for them or whatnot, the big takeaway would be just to be there with them, to talk through any issues they see, to see how they're reacting, to turn off the TV if it looks like it's getting too extreme. You know, I think you have to be really, really, really in tune with your kids to guide them through this entertainment saturated world. And every kid, as I say, is different.
I definitely remember, I believe I was probably 11. My dad showed me A New Hope. And I freaked out at the bloody arm and then I know at the charred skeletons. And I'm a very different person now. I have become very desensitized, unfortunately, but I'm 23. So, you know, it's okay. I was a sensitive kid. And so I definitely get parents know the kids the best. Yeah. So understanding what they can handle in that point.
Yeah. I'll give you a weird example. And this is not even a movie, but when I was a little kid, like 4 or 5 years old, I was over at my grandma's house and there were a whole bunch of people. I think it was close to Christmas. Someone had given my grandmother an old record of episodes of this old-time radio drama called The Shadow, right? And it was really cool, and we all sat around and listened to it. And there was this one episode that featured this mirror. And the mirror, you know, the Shadow was this supernatural thing. There was a detective that always had like he was trying to investigate a little bit of these ghost stories, these murder stories. So it was kind of dark for like a 5-year-old. But it was old timey. Like this show was probably 1939 or something like that. But we listened to this episode, and it featured a mirror that would show people who were about to die. It had this big legend attached to it. And so you would see that there was this person who was trying to be driven crazy, and this woman would see people who were about to die in the mirror. So fast forward a couple of hours, we're sleeping over at grandma's. I'm in a big bed by myself and in an unfamiliar house. And over at the foot of the bed is a dresser with a huge mirror. Over the top of the bed where I'm laying, there's a picture of my grandma's grandma. And I freaked out. And I will tell you honestly, this may destroy any sort of respect you might have had for me, but I really did not sleep in a room with a mirror until I absolutely had to when I went to college.
Oh,
that was the first time I ever slept with a mirror again in my room, because it just freaked me out so badly to see that. So, this stuff, it sticks with you. It can last with you. And sometimes it gives you kind of a nice little story like this, but it can be really bothersome. And, it can cause kids sleepless nights, and that means parents might have some sleepless nights. And that's probably not a great thing.
Yeah, they go hand in hand. I even remember you mentioned audio dramas, and I was like, oh man, should I bring up Adventures in Odyssey? There were a few Adventures in Odyssey episodes that gave me sleepless nights, but I think Chris warned us. Chris warned us that it was a parental guidance episode, and I didn't listen to her, so.
So it's on you.
Of course, I'm not blaming Focus on the Family at all. You mentioned scaring kids, because sometimes they need a skin knee, like you said. How is violence different from sex and language? Because I would say that they are. The latter, sex and language, are kind of things that can latch on to somebody's mind in a passive way, whereas violence, I don't really think that any kid is going to see a superhero movie and actually do anything violent besides pretend, whereas the other two might be more intense. Those are really the three that are talked about with these movie reviews, whether it's Kids in Mind or you guys. Is there anything that makes sense there?
Well, I will say, no, I think that's a really valid point. And see, this is a really interesting point, because I do think that sort of the evangelical subculture, which we both belong to, they tend to give violence a little bit more of a pass. I think that we love our action movies. A lot of us have roots within the military, all that kind of stuff. We tend to accept that a little bit more, which is one of the reasons why I think the Lord of the Rings movies are a little bit more navigable for a lot of parents kind of within our sphere. There's a lot of violence, but it's violence with a good purpose, right? The good guys are fighting the bad guys. It has a great message at the end. And so that allows us to sort of excuse it. But it can, again, and this is sort of dependent on the kid, it can impact the kid, and it can be a tricky thing to navigate. Yeah, you do pretend, right? You do. I remember as a kid, I loved my superheroes, and I would throw on a blanket, tie it around my neck, and pretend that I was zipping all around. But I also remember kind of hitting my sister pretty bad one time because we were playing, and I think that you have these elements where you can pretend, and the pretendness for some kids can cross into reality a little bit more. And the other thing is that it does get into a bit of desensitization. One of the most interesting arguments that I really ponder in my own head is, what's the difference between like cartoonish violence and like realistic depictions of violence? Because I think you could make an argument, Bugs Bunny, Roadrunner, you have all this slapstick violence all over the place. Mm-hmm. But when you watch that, it can make you think that it's all just harmless, and you don't need to worry about anvils on the head, because you'll just grow a big bump, and 30 seconds later you'll be just fine. When you have realistic violence, it can impact you more. I personally sometimes wonder whether it is good for that impact to be felt. that this stuff hurts, that this stuff can harm you. It's something that I still think about a lot when I go to movies that have either those extremes, the slapstick violence or more realistic depictions of it.
And I think, again, you would always encourage the parents to talk about it. I've even heard of the rule that some parents said of, we will pause the movie to talk about something for the sake of talking about it. I know the two, when it comes to sex and language, that my dad did. The Last Crusade had Indy getting down with the love interest of the movie, and he paused and said, "Seth, we don't do this," and he's like, "Yes, Dad." And then moving on. The other one was, I think, October Sky, where they're swearing up a storm, and he paused and said, "We don't talk like this, okay, kids?" And we're like, "Yes, Dad," and we hit play again. So it could be as simple as that, or it could be a conversation about why we should or shouldn't do something that's portrayed in those movies.
Well, and I think that's really it's very key, and it gets back to something that I said earlier. I think that these discussions, these conversations that kids have with their parents, that is really an important element of these movies. I think the most harmful thing that can happen when you're dealing with movies or entertainment of any kind is that you just let your kids watch it without any sort of, awareness of what they're even getting into. And I think parents need to be aware of what their kids are interested in, watch it when possible, and talk through it, because I think that it's important that parents guide their kids through some of these things.
What place do products like VidAngel have in a family's life? How much, this still kind of relates to keeping innocence versus exposing. How much should we be filtering and how much should we be showing what the world is like? But products like VidAngel still let you watch the movie but take everything out. I haven't used it, so I can't say from experience what it's like, but I'm sure you're familiar with it.
Yeah, I am familiar with it, and it's a really tricky question. I think from a plugged-in point of view, we would say that VidAngel does a lot of really great things, and I think that they do provide tools for parents. I come from a journalistic background, and I worked for papers for a bazillion years. So for me, I do also think about some of those First Amendment issues when you're talking about the creators for these films. They want to get across something, and a lot of times the content that they have in them, even though as a plugged-in reviewer I would say, man, it's too bad that they have all that content. It's sort of the right of the creator to bring that content forward. An example that I might use would be The Passion of the Christ, which was released a billion years ago. But it had a lot of really, really, really extreme content. It still is one of the most viscerally violent movies that I've seen, and really wince-worthy violence. A lot of people would argue, and I totally get this argument, that you need to show that violence in order to get that message across. How Christ died for us, what he suffered, all of these kinds of elements. I get that. If you sort of filtered out that content, a lot of that power, the power that Mel Gibson wanted to bring to his product, would be stripped away. So I think there would be a robust argument as to whether that would be a good thing or a bad thing.
Do you think there's a line that shouldn't be crossed for Christians, excluding kids right now, excluding parenting? Is it truly up to us to determine what we can handle, or always avoiding R-rated movies? Again, you just brought up Passion of the Christ, but that's kind of the thing that is said. Even in some PG-13 movies, they really push that line of into R, but keeping it, only one F-bomb, maybe even two for some reason. I don't get that. Even if it's labeled heavy on plugged in for an adult, is it bad if an adult still goes and sees it? Like, for some of us, I feel like there's a couple that you could list that are just objectively don't go see this as a Christian. What do you think of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So let me ask you. Let me flip this on its head and ask you, what would you say would you think might be off limits?
I actually, when we started this podcast, I did an episode 0 of what we believe or what I believe or how I approach movies. And I initially said supernatural horror is off limits. And then my friend came to me and said, "Can we talk?" And we did a whole episode about, is horror biblical? And I think that's one of our best performing episodes. I know that I even saw on Twitter you posted a similar article that was along the lines of, it shows good and evil very clearly as opposed to something else. But I feel like I've been torn almost, because I'm a Marvel fan and I have been rooting for them to get back on their feet these last couple of years as I've seen them fail. And I really want Deadpool and Wolverine to be good, but I don't think I should or can go watch it quote unquote, because it's just not going to be good for me. I know fellow co-hosts here on the podcast who are my friends, they have said the same thing. Like, they'll just look at the synopsis after it comes out. I'm torn in that one specifically. It's just not good for my brain. I know that, but part of me is like, I really want to go see it for the lore and for what it's going to do for one of my favorite franchises ever. So
yeah. It's a really tricky question. And I would say the way you are approaching these movies is exactly the way that people should approach it. I think that you're probably more aware maybe of like what is good for you and what is bad for you than many, because I think that a lot of us, and it's just human nature, we sort of adjust we excuse certain things that we want to see, right? We say, this isn't going to affect me. This is not going to be bad for me. I really want to see this. And so we sort of push it aside. And I think that can be, as a Christian, that can be a dangerous thing, because we can lie to ourselves pretty easily. We can justify our actions pretty easily. We do it all the time. And so it can be a tricky thing to sort of navigate. For me, like, I have a hard time understanding why Christians would go see a Saw movie. I can deal with supernatural horror because of all those reasons, the good and evil and the light and the dark, and dealing with some of these big thematic elements that can actually point you to Christ. When I look at Saw and I look at some of those things predicated on torture and gore, that's a harder thing for me to understand. Now, at the same time, I know Christians who go see them, and I don't want to judge them for what they're doing, but I just can't see it myself. I do think that we draw a line sometimes with some of the sexual content that we see. Sometimes that can be so corrosive and so pervasive that we need to be very aware of our weaknesses and stay away from that. Even swearing, I think that's one of the sneakiest things that enters into movies. And everybody who I know who has come with me to a movie and watched me mark down all these swear words, they're amazed, because they say, I had no idea there was so much swearing in that. Because when you're an adult, you just sort of gloss over that. And then you can show it to your favorite movie. You can show it to your kids, 10 years later, and you'll say, oh my goodness, I had no idea that it was so bad, because we excuse these things. So it can be a really difficult question. I do think that there are things that have the potential to be more harmful than others. I think the skin element, the sex element, that can be really problematic. The torture porn element can be, I think, really problematic. But you also just have to be so aware of what might give you, the viewer, issues. For me, actually, one of the trickiest things to watch can be like simple romantic comedies, which is crazy. But because my wife and I got married when we were really, really young, because we've been married for so long, those movies can potentially, you sort of think about, oh man, if I had had a few more years to date, what would that have looked like? And that can be a dangerous place for somebody, to walk into, just sort of idealizing some of those elements. So,
well, it kind of reminds me of Romans 14, which was kind of eye-opening to me when I truly read it. You read Bible passages and then you read Bible passages and it clicks and you think about it and you meditate on it. And it's the one that says, for if your brother is grieved by what you eat, you are no longer walking in love. By what you eat, do not destroy the one for whom Christ died. And then later on it says, do not for the sake of food destroy the work of God. Everything is indeed clean, but it is wrong for anyone to make another stumble by what he eats. It is not good to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that causes your brother to stumble. So that's making sure you put limits on other people, yes, but it also should be yourself. It should be setting yourself up for success, more or less, to make sure you can handle it and knowing yourself better than anyone else.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
As we were talking about horror being kind of firm, good and evil, light and dark, and how that has kind of been turning on its head to explore that area, even if it's often people still don't want to see it because I don't like being jump scared or something like that. That's totally fine. But what about the evil that's more hidden? This was the point that my friend made in the Horrors Biblical episode. Having something more hidden in a kids movie. The thing that comes to my mind right away is Lightyear. That was really a big conversation when it came out among Christian parents because there was a gay kiss in it. And there have been many other movies like that. But it was one that was marketed to kids. It was that's kind of Disney's thing right now, is to make sure it's in there somewhere, but it's more hidden. And of course, parents will talk about it parents should be talking about it with their kids. It should be a topic of conversation. You're like, you saw that? This is how it's supposed to be. But then again, you don't want to expose that. I don't know.
Yeah.
The evil that's hidden rather than the evil that's obvious.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that's kind of one of the reasons why Plugged In exists, right? We try to give people a heads up on some of those issues, because we don't want parents to be taken by surprise. We don't want them to go into a movie thinking this is going to be great, and then all of a sudden there's a 3-second scene that impacts how they think about the movie. We want to make sure that they're aware of it. And I wonder sometimes, this is going to be a tricky area to walk through, right? But in some ways, it can depend on how hidden it is, right? And I think about a movie like Onward. I'm not sure if you've seen Onward. So it is a Pixar movie. It came out right as COVID was starting to go. So it didn't get like a huge amount of traction because everybody got locked down. But it's a story about two brothers who essentially go. There's a magical thing that happens. They live in this magical world. They're actually elves or something like that. And they have the ability to bring their dad back from the dead for 24 hours. Something goes wrong and they only bring back half of him, right? And it becomes, so we could talk a little bit about the spiritual elements of that. There are going to be some parents who, on the face of it, bringing back your dad from the dead, that could have some huge issues. As a plot point, it made a lot of sense, and it led to some beautiful ruminations about parenthood, about being a good son, about brothers, loving each other, and how one can be a father figure to another. Had some really, really resonant messages for me. But there was a moment in there where an ancillary character, a female character, just mentions very briefly about her wife. And it is one of those things where that is very hidden. I didn't see it actually when I first watched it. Had to go back and rewatch it for that scene to come about, for me to see that scene. And that is obviously hidden, and it was hidden there for a reason. Obviously Pixar Disney was sending a message with that, and that's something that parents need to be really, really aware of. Part of me also wonders how many kids would ever even notice. If me, a professional movie reviewer, did not see it, would a 6-year-old notice that? Would that impact how a 6-year-old is going to think? So again, it's one of the reasons why we try to leave it up to parents, because I think a lot of parents might have different answers to that. I found the story, if I was a parent of young kids, I think the messages in the story would be stronger than that one moment. But there's a lot of parents who would disagree with that, and that's totally fine. I don't know if that answered your question, but... No,
it does. I like that. I think when it comes to parenting, kids are going to kind of get the gist of the story, because they don't always remember details that well, and it goes over their head. I'd say if they were watching a full movie about, or at least a secondary character had that storyline of being gay, that would probably make more of an impact and cause more conversation. But I think that line was in there for Disney to show, hey, this is whose side we're on, and for all of the parents who did pick up on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. These are interesting times that we live in, right? Because you do have those elements, and they're becoming more and more. You definitely have a lot of movies where those elements are very much out there, and you can't skip over them. You can't ignore them. Strange World had a very important character who was gay, and so you have these elements that as parents you are going to need to if you are going to take your kids to the movies at all, and they're new movies, these are elements that parents are just going to have to grapple with, because it's hard to find quote unquote safe entertainment for them anymore.
Yeah. Sometimes I think about what movie would be like a totally okay, no conversation needed. It's like Peanuts, I think. Peanuts was a G-rated movie that came out very recently, which you never get. And it's just the Peanuts. All the kids. I think it was a pretty faithful adaptation to the comics as well. but I remember really liking that. Speaking of movies that we really like, one thing that we kind of connect on is the Inside Out 2 that just came out. And this is spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen Inside Out 2. But I remember, I believe it was in our 2024 movie predictions episode, that I boldly said that I didn't think Inside Out 2 would be better, in the sense that I thought that they were going to go with Riley going through puberty and she's discovering who she is and discovering who she really likes, and they would follow that path. And I was glad to be proven wrong, but I was ready to hate on it just as soon as I have almost anything else Disney has put out these days. But I was very pleasantly surprised. I really enjoyed it. I want to hear what you thought going into it and what you think of it now, or even because you wrote the reason. Sorry, I didn't even mention this. You wrote the Inside Out review on Plugged In.
I did
officially. Like you had to do your job to see this movie.
That's exactly right. So first off, I was a huge fan of. I loved the original Inside Out. This was, as a matter of fact, when I was really starting my own podcast outside of Plugged In, it was one of the very first conversations that I had with my co-host, because Inside Out did such a remarkable job of walking you through a kid's emotions and an adult's emotions too. It gave you a new vocabulary for how to talk with your friends, talk with your kids especially, about what they're going through. I loved the concept of islands of identity, where you have these islands of the things that you love. And even to this day, I still think of those islands. Inside Out 2, because of Disney and Pixar's spotty history, I think it would be fair to say, the quality has not been quite as right on as it used to be. There was a time where Pixar could do no wrong. After Inside Out, the quality of the movies, just looking at it from an aesthetic point of view, they weren't always as good as they had been. You had those elements where they were pushing certain things into their movies that could be problematic. And so, I went in very wary. And there was a lot of buzz online before the movie came out based on the trailers that, Riley was going to have a same-sex attraction. That proved to not be the case at all. And instead, it really was a delightful look at just the insecurities of a 13-year-old girl. Trying to figure out how to make new friends, how to fit in, how to, as she starts looking toward her future, how to succeed in that future. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure if you know this, Seth, but I've dealt with a certain amount of mental illness in my lifetime. So depression is a part of my story. Anxiety, I'm fairly familiar with. So when you see those elements that we saw in Inside Out 2, where Riley's self-belief structure, I guess, where it moves from I'm a good person to, because of a new emotion, anxiety comes onto the scene. And because of the way anxiety is pushing her buttons, all of a sudden her self-belief becomes sort of this sense of, I'm not good enough. And I think that so many teens can relate to that message. I'm not good enough. And so many adults can too. It was such a powerful, awful, really, moment, because we see this little girl being twisted up by the anxiety that's in her. The way the movie handled that anxiety and the way it ended up resolving it, although it's not really resolved, it's not nearly that easy in the movie or in real life, I thought was really beautiful. Because, and I'm just going to go off on a little bit of a tangent, what you have is you had Riley worried that she's not good enough. She feels like she's failing. She feels like she's letting her friends down. She's not good enough. And she has a full-blown panic attack. What do her friends do? They skate over beside her. They try to make sure that she's doing okay. And you see that same dynamic with the emotions inside Riley, these anthropomorphic emotions inside her, where anxiety is just driving everything. She's frozen, essentially. And she's frozen everything up in Riley's brain too. What do the other emotions do? They come around her and they hug her. And, as I was thinking about it, as I was leaving the movie, it reminded me that in some ways, that's what God does to us, right? We know as Christians that there's an element of truth to that I'm not good enough. We are fallen creatures. We have failed. We have sinned, and what we have done has separated us from God. But God comes alongside us and he embraces us and he tells us that he loves us. And if we accept that love, it makes all the difference in the world. I thought it was just a beautiful message, not only what we do with people who are suffering, who are dealing with anxiety, who are dealing with problems in their own life, what we can do as their friends, as their parents, to come alongside them. But I thought it was a beautiful reflection on God's love for us as well.
Do you think that the preemptive panic that ensued from everyone in the Christian sphere, in the Christian community, was warranted? Or, our guards have been up. Our guards have kind of hardened over the last couple of years when we've realized that stuff is becoming more obvious.
I think that I am always I'm a wait and see person. I really, and this goes, I think that a lot of parents, a lot of Christian parents have become cynical of Disney and Pixar, and they have been given a lot of reasons to be. I tend to be, again, maybe because of my journalistic background, I tend to be really cynical of a lot of things. And so when I hear people talking about things, elements that they don't know for sure are in them, I really push pause. I think that oftentimes we can overreact because we've been hurt, because we have reason to fear. But sometimes it's just good to take a breath and say, all right, let's see. Let's let this play out. That's kind of the way I try to take a stance. I just don't, it's not as much in my DNA to say, oh, this is going to be bad. I need to see it first before I can really make that determination.
Yeah. And I think you're bringing up the intensity of certain aspects of the movie. So when you brought up the one line in Onward, there's that compared to what Pixar used to do. And one of my favorite jokes in Cars, Mater misunderstanding lightning saying piston cup. Those things are like the old videos of like, oh, this adult's joke is hidden in a kid's movie. It's changed. It's shifted from what we used to think of Pixar, making sure that, well, I think people have often said that Pixar is adult movies made for kids. They often have adult themes. That's kind of why we are here and why I talk about movies so much, is like we just did an episode on Cars and explored Lightning McQueen's character and the Mater's character and all the other side people who have that story that can be talked about. And yeah, it's really great.
Yeah. Let me just say something about Pixar too, because I think Pixar, again, we've sort of said Pixar is not necessarily what it used to be, and who knows what they're going to do in the future. But when they are on, it is amazing, because I think what they do is they make some really not very sexy concepts work incredibly well. Right. I think of Brave, the relationship between the daughter and the mom, and how I think a lot of typical movies would say, oh, let's let the kid do her own thing. Brave really fleshed out the idea. Yes, there's a point in time where teens need to make their own decisions to some extent, but it needs to be done within the realm of responsibility, within the realm of family. Up, I think, is one of the most powerful ruminations I have ever seen on grief and moving on. Even when you're talking about Inside Out, just sort of the idea that both Inside Out movies, where it's too easy to say, let's move into this sense of happiness. Let's move into this sense of I am a good person. The message of Inside Out 2 was not to go back to that, because that can be delusional. We are definitely complex people, and we have all done things that we are not proud of. And the movie embraces that, and it embraces it in such a moving, emotional way, where you walk away feeling like, oh, I get it now.
And I think maybe we're talking too much about Inside Out, but since I don't really want to do an Inside Out episode yet, thinking about Riley saying I'm a good person, and that's her belief system, and the whole belief system was very interesting to visualize, and the way that they chose to do that. Thinking about that could be a conversation. Do you believe you're a good person? And I know you've reviewed Living Waters as one of the YouTube channels, so I'm sure you're slightly familiar with them. That's one of Ray Comfort's questions that he asks when witnessing. Are you a good person? Do you believe that you are going to heaven? And that's something that is different for each person, and their experiences have changed what they think about that. And it really is influential in how they approach life and the differences and all that.
One of the most powerful and upsetting messages of Christianity is, I think that we all tend to see ourselves as the heroes of our own story. Right? We are the good guys. When you look at us realistically, we are sometimes the bad guys. We sometimes wear the black hats. And Christianity sort of forces us to accept that. We are beautiful creatures made by God, made with the power and with God's help, the impulse to do beautiful, wonderful things for other people. Left to our own devices, we can be real jerks, and we sometimes forget that. And for a movie to sort of remind us that, we can be, that's an important thing for us to really remember. We're not as good as sometimes we'd like to think we are. And every day we have to try. We have to try to follow God's word a little bit better. We have to try to be the creatures that he made a little bit closer.
Yeah. I wanted to kind of get a little silly here. Are you familiar with the Pixar theory? Since we're on the topic of Pixar, what do you think of interconnected movies that are not really?
Yeah. So the idea is, it just so I understand this, every Pixar movie has like a little bit of an Easter egg to another movie, right? You see Pizza Planet in Monsters Inc. or whatnot. So I love those little Easter eggs, and I like to think of them as all being in sort of one universe. I don't follow the theory well enough to know how cars, like these anthropomorphic vehicles, actually fits into the whole thing, because that seems like it could get a little bit dark eventually. Who knows? But I do like the fact that you have these little intentional winks and nods to what has come, and I think that's pretty cool. It doesn't really impact how I see the movies. I like to see them as standalone movies, but I really do. I just like the thought that you see them put into that,
Yeah.
And John Ratzenberger in every single movie. How is that possible?
He's the eternal being. I know fitting cars into the Pixar theory was really a stretch, I think, but I think it technically comes after WALL-E and all of the humans go extinct.
Yeah, that seems dark.
Man. But I think the one thing that I love most about the Pixar theory is in Brave. I brought this whole thing up because you mentioned Brave. The witch has a drawing of Sully on one of her wood plaques. And on top of that, she uses doors as part of her magic. So people think that Monsters Inc. is one of the last movies or something like that, no, closer to the end. And Boo grows up to try and find this magic that was through doors. She remembers as like a 2-year-old that there was a creature that she loved that came through doors. She remembered Sully, so she drew him out, and the doors were a way that she kind of conjured her own magic. Wow. I think it's really creative, but I don't think it has any legs to stand on, especially as more come out. Everyone's like, the updated Pixar theory, let's make sure this fits and make sure it works. It doesn't really work.
Yeah, it feels like if you go way down on this rabbit trail, you think about all the stuff that Star Wars, the Star Wars franchise is doing. That's a whole galaxy to explore, right? And then you can have so many different stories. Theoretically, you could have so many different stories to explore in the Pixar universe too. I don't know how many of those stories I'd want to watch, but who knows? They might surprise me. I never wanted to watch Up when it first came out either, but that proved out to be pretty great. So shows how much I know.
I know we have the Nolan Bros here on the One Night Film podcast, and we love all of the Christopher Nolan movies. And I believe once we watch through all of them, we're going to make the Nolan cinematic universe. I like our theory for that because he uses so many different actors. And so we're going to try and figure out where Michael Caine fits in, where Christian Bale fits in, because they keep showing up, man.
It's incredible. And I tell you what, Christopher Nolan, he is pretty brilliant, but super strange. I still don't know what Tenet is all about. And part of it is because I couldn't hear it. So maybe that's part of the problem. But
It's true. It's hard to recommend that movie. It's actually one of my favorites, and one of my co-hosts severely disagrees with me on that. But I love the music because it's about the only thing you can hear. You need to watch it with subtitles. Their thick accents, their mask, the loud music. It's still an interesting concept to me. And
Tom Hardy Bane would have fit right in with that movie.
True. How has working at Plugged In affected the way you parent kids? And even though they're older now, I assume, I saw you just had a granddaughter born, which congratulations about that.
Yes. So exciting.
One, back when you were raising kids, how did that affect if you were, maybe you weren't working at Plugged In. I suppose I assume wrongly there.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I think I was kind of raised. My parents knew nothing about Plugged In, but I was kind of raised in a reasonably, the shadow aside, I was raised in a fairly protected environment. I wasn't allowed to watch certain TV shows because they were a little risque. There was some protective hedges around me. And so I think that we raised our kids in kind of the same way. One of the things that we always did when our kids were really little is we always watched whatever they watched. We just made it a point. We were going to sit down, and it really became a great bonding moment for us, right? We grew up with the cartoons that they watched. We were able to laugh at them together. It was fantastic. But it also allowed us to be able to see things, to be able to talk through things that might be problematic. And that was kind of important for us. So by the time I came to Plugged In, the kids were getting a little bit younger, or not younger. That's a very Pixar thing. They were getting older. And so it wasn't quite the same. I would take them to movie screenings sometimes, and we would be able to talk through some of the issues that we saw in the movies as we were driving home or whatnot. So I can't say that it didn't impact me, but it did it helped confirm that, what we were trying to do with our kids was kind of the right thing to do. I'd like to think so. I don't think that we were ever really super duper restrictive, but we did take our entertainment seriously, and we wanted our kids to take it seriously too. It was interesting. I took my son, when he was mid-teen, I think, we took him to see Prince Caspian. It's based on C.S. Lewis. It's a really nice story, all this kind of stuff. And it was interesting because after the movie, there are some pretty intense places. And we walked out and he said, man, that was a violent movie. That was way more violent than The Dark Knight. Which was interesting, because The Dark Knight back in the day, they were talking about maybe this should have been rated R because it was so violent. And I said, what are you talking about, son? What is with this? Don't you remember the pencil scene? Don't you remember? But he made a good case that was a really violent, hard movie. When we talk about going back to our conversation on violence, my son was very, very sensitive to violence. And so those moments impacted him more, even as a mid-teen when he was going to see, quote unquote, a pretty family friendly movie. It impacted him pretty interestingly.
Did that have to do with, I suppose that was who he is, but did that affect maybe your perspective on it? You kind of talked about what you thought about it compared to The Dark Knight in that moment.
Yeah, it totally did. It totally did, because it was for a review. So we went and watched it, and when he started talking about the violence, when I sat down to write the review, all of that was in my brain. I was very mindful of how it affected my son. And I knew that he was not going to be alone. This was going to be something that other kids might deal with as well. And on the flip side, to take it back to a parenting perspective, that's one of the reasons why I think it's always good for parents to be able to watch this stuff with their kids. Because just as my son influenced what I thought of the movie and what I wrote about the movie, parents influence their kids on what they see. It doesn't mean that they're going to change how they feel about it. It doesn't mean, I still think The Dark Knight is a pretty great and pretty violent movie. And I would still argue the pencil scene is really harsh. But I was impacted by what my son said. And when we are parents, we have a responsibility to lead them not only in our faith, but through this culture, and try to walk them through how we react to it, what we think about it, what we feel about certain things. That's part of our responsibility as parents. And sometimes I think that we sort of shove that aside and we just don't think about it as much. But your kids just listen to you. And even when they're teens and you don't think they're listening to you, they do. And it's important to remember that.
Yeah. Even since I'm a little bit closer to graduating teenhood,
being
a teenager, I remember there was something specifically that I'm not going to mention, but it was that they were telling me while I was a teenager, and I didn't appreciate it. I didn't process it until I was later in life, and I thought about it and go, man, mom and dad were right. And I know my mom's gonna hear that and she's gonna be like, I told you so. But it's getting through to them. And
Yeah.
I have no parenting experience, but teens can't be given up on, and that's kind of back to Inside Out too. Like, just keep loving them.
Well, and I tell you what, Seth, as you get older, the more wise your parents are going to feel. I mean, by the time you're 40, you're going to think, oh my goodness, they knew what they were talking about all this time. So
True. Yeah.
I'll give you another example. Notoriously, I'm a big superhero fan. I wrote a book about Batman, all this kind of stuff. When I was growing up, I was not allowed to engage with superheroes because my dad, he believed that superheroes were sort of like this. These superheroes could distract you from who should be our real hero, which was Christ. That drove me up the wall when I was a kid, because I loved my superheroes. And I still do, right? You don't have to take what your parents say, completely whole cloth, right? You don't necessarily, but the fact is, having watched as many superhero movies as I have, having really analyzed them, there's some truth in that. I mean, some of these, especially now within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you see these elements of demigods. And can they be distracting? I think they could be. Can you still enjoy them? I think a lot of people can. But at the same time, when you're dealing with, like, for instance, the last Thor movie, you have all these gods sort of piled into one place, and they're all ludicrous. And for some people, they will look at that pantheon of gods. You have this divine piece of food. You have Zeus. You have Mayan gods. All these different things. It's meant to be very, very silly. Someone could look at that and walk away saying, any god is silly. Religion is silly. There could be people who come away from that movie with that message. And so it's just one of those things that you just need to be mindful of, that one person can watch that and laugh and go to church and it'll be fine. But there can be stumbling blocks in all these movies, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting that your dad had that perspective on it. When I was inspired to start this podcast, one from the conversations I was already having with my friends, but the book by Frank Turek called Hollywood Heroes, where he's explaining the essence or the aspects of characters, mostly pop culture characters, not a specific one necessarily, and how they have bits and pieces of the perfect hero, which is Jesus. Right. So I guess it could go either way. Yeah,
and that's always my argument. When I write about superhero movies, it is all about that. I just rewatched Iron Man, and you see in Iron Man almost a picture perfect redemption story. God's not really mentioned in there, but you have this guy. He looks like a guy who you would see on stage at any evangelical church in the country giving his testimony, right? I sinned. I was doing all this stuff. I was hedonistic. I was not a good person, and I was missing the boat. That would be Tony Stark, before his near-death experience, literally. And when you look at the symbolism of Iron Man, it's fascinating because he literally was given essentially a new heart. He had something put next to his heart that would keep him alive. And he tells Pepper Potts, I should not be alive unless it was for a reason. And as you watch these superhero movies, step after step after step after step, one of the things that's so brilliant about kind of the whole Marvel saga up until Endgame is that it leads up to that reason. It was so well constructed, that beautiful moment of sacrifice where, spoiler alert, he snaps and brings things back to the way they should be. It's so powerful, I think. And so you do have those elements where it speaks to how one person can look at the same form of media that another person is looking at and come away with a totally, totally different point of view.
Yeah, for sure. I'm wondering, maybe not everyone has the same, I know not everyone has the same opinions as me. I kind of have not a hate, a strong dislike for the MPAA rating system right now because it's so bare bones. And to me, it's outdated. And I feel like Plugged In does a lot better job at kind of breaking it down, like what's the intensity. But honestly, PG-13, and R are not a lot to go off of. Does that ever come up as a internal or external conversation
Yeah.
to figure out, like, just because it's just PG or just I mean, we talked about PG-13 movies pushing that line very recently.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It's honestly, it's one of the reasons why Plugged In exists. You know, just as I just don't think that parents should have a lot of confidence necessarily in the ratings, because especially now, you know, when you have so many kids movies that are pushing content that a lot of parents would object to, they just don't help very much. But that's not a new thing. I think that the ratings can be a helpful tool, but they never give you the full picture. And you know, one of the frustrating things about dealing with entertainment, especially when you're trying to help your kids walk through it, is that it's hard work. You know, whether you're talking about the MPAA ratings or you're talking about Plugged In's color ratings, they can be tools, but they never tell you the whole story. And parents are so busy that, you know, they don't have time to sift through a 2,000 word review all the time. So they use those shortcuts. But sometimes those shortcuts cannot tell you everything you kind of want to know. So
Yeah. And it's interesting when you look at the history of the rating system, when it just was PG and R, and not the Last Crusade, the Raiders of the Lost Ark, and as it went through Indiana Jones, basically those trilogies, it really is like, you know what, these really aren't PG, but they're not bad enough for R, so they added another one. I feel like, to me, they should add a couple more, and maybe you can't nail it down to just putting it in a box, I suppose, but they're not really helpful anymore. I think that's pretty obvious.
Yeah. And it's tricky too, because one of the things that we pay attention to a lot at Plugged In is not just like the really more superficial content, you know, the sexual content, the violence, the language. Those are important things to pay attention to. But worldview, I mean, what is a movie saying about Christianity? What is it talking about as far as your relationship to your family? Those things don't really fall under a rating system at all, no matter how many letters you get. And so it can be really difficult for a parent to walk through there. You just don't know until you do your research.
And that's why you don't just box it into sexual violence and language. You have the positive elements, negative elements, spiritual elements, extras. I think you have an extras section. But yeah, I really like that, of how you've kind of mastered your craft there at Plugged In to figure out what's actually useful, what's useful information, more than just those things that kids in mind can list that. But the worldview is a very important part of movie reviews for you guys.
Yeah, it really is. It really is, because it's important to our readers, and it's important to me. You know, I am a story guy. I really pay attention to what is in a story, because, man, stories move me. Stories have changed my life in a lot of ways. And so I want to make sure that we take the stories that these creators are telling us really seriously. And whether it's good or whether it's bad or whether it's a mixture of both, we want to impact that.
Sure. I've always been curious to ask somebody who either sometimes gets early access to movies or at least has a different mindset when going to see movies. How do you take notes and still enjoy the movie or see the movie as a whole thing? For one, literally, how do you take notes? Do you have a little light? Is that distracting? You want to make sure you're not messing up other people's experience. How do you do that when you go for the job of
Yeah, so I wonder if I can even show you this. Probably your listeners won't be able to see this, but and I don't think I have a pen here. But yes, I have a light up pen. Essentially, there are pens that you can buy that light up, and they're really.
I'm intrigued now.
Yeah, they're really subtle. So they just have a little pinpoint light that shines from the very tip. And so you just are able to write. Now, I have terrible handwriting, so it's not necessarily all that helpful. But when I can read, it's great. So that's essentially what I do. I come in with a sheet of with a big notepad. I come in with an actual separate sheet of paper that I can mark down all the swear words, and I sit down and I just mark and write as much as I can. You know, I try to get down quotes. I try to talk a little bit about what is happening in certain scenes, but it can be really challenging, especially in a movie that has a lot of content, because you can have people, you know, getting frisky and being violent and swearing all at the same time. And so while you're writing down one thing, you might be missing something entirely different. So it can be a challenge.
Gosh, I really do not envy the job of whoever had to review Wolf of Wall Street. The one who was known as the one that has the most swear words. But
yeah, that would be my cohort, Adam. Yeah, he had writer's cramps for sure at the end. Yeah, and you do try not to bother people. To answer another part of your question is you are working, right? So because you're taking notes, another question that I get a lot is how do you watch all this terrible stuff and are not affected by it personally? And I think the note taking can be a huge factor of it. You're working, and so you're at a little bit of a remove, but that also means that you're removed a little bit from the good impact that a movie can have. You don't necessarily enjoy it while you're taking notes. And if there's as much, at least. And if there's a movie that I really dig, then that's the time when I'll talk to my wife and say, you know what? I think we need to see Dune 2.
Yeah. For example, Inside Out 2, did you go and watch that not on the clock or something?
So the sad reality of our job is that we watch so many movies, and it can be really, really hard for us to go out. It has to be a really special movie. And I do think Inside Out is a really special movie, but it can be super hard for us to just find the time. I probably see sometimes as many as 4 movies a week, and there's just not a lot of time nor honestly inclination to see. I like movies, but man, sometimes you say, you know what I want to do? I want to sit home and read, and that's what you want to do.
Yeah, I get that. With that being said, when you do choose to watch a movie again, whether it's new or old, can you easily switch your mind between movie enjoyer and movie reviewer? As in, like, so you're not you're not tracking all the swear words, you're not thinking about it in that way. Is that easy for you, or?
So my old boss actually said that the job will ruin movie watching for you forever, because you won't be able to watch a movie without taking notes, even mentally. Yeah. That is, I have not found that to be true. Honestly, like I find that when I watch a movie a second time, I am really emotionally attuned to it. I don't know why. Sometimes the second time through makes me a little bit more emotional with it than I think I would have been otherwise. But at the same time, there's always a little bit of my brain engaged in that plugged in world where I can be watching something and I'll say, oh, that's so cool. That's so wonderful. Oh, so sweet. Oh, I missed that in the review. I need to go back and put that in.
The constant editor is wanting to make sure it's perfect.
Exactly.
That's funny. Well, I don't have much more for us to talk about, but I did want to ask you about the few books that you've written. You've written a number for and with Focus on the Family, whether on the title with Jim Daly or just your own. I'm really curious about your movie-centered books. You have God on the Streets of Gotham. That's pretty obviously what you were talking about earlier, Batman and the comparison with the story, but also I feel like Burning Bush 2.0, how pop culture replaced the prophet, feels like it would kind of relate to that. So tell us a little bit about that and why we should buy it, and maybe yourself.
So how pop culture replaced the prophet is really just sort of a rundown, and it sort of gets to one of my passion points, I guess. You know, for my job at Plugged In, one of the things I do is I tell parents everything that's in a movie. I tell them what they need to be watching out for, and it tends to be pretty cautionary. But as I said, I kind of love movies. I really dig stories, and I think that a lot of times we can find what I would call God's fingerprints on some of these secular stories. And so that particular book is really sort of blasting through a lot of different spheres of entertainment and just sort of talking about how you can sort of look for God in some of these stories and some of the things that I've found to be powerful in some of these stories. And, you know, even maybe talking points that you can have with your friends about what is true. You know, one of the driving things that we have at Plugged In is Philippians 4:8. You know, finally, brothers, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there's any virtue and if there's anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. I think a lot of times, and fairly so, that means that we should be really protective of what we see, what we listen to, what video games we play, all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, you know, when I think about Paul, when he was writing that words, the world that he was living in was not particularly noble or true or beautiful at times. He was walking through a world of slaves, a world where, you know, there was sewage in the streets. He couldn't seal himself off from some of those issues. And And so that book, Burning Bush 2.0, is really sort of thinking about, yes, be careful about what you watch, but be mindful that sometimes, even in difficult content, you can find some good, you can find some pure. You can find some truth in some of these more difficult things. Doesn't mean you should just embrace them all. Doesn't mean that you should throw away kind of your discernment hat. Even as an adult, you just need to be mindful of that stuff. But sometimes difficult pieces of entertainment can come with some power, and spiritual power.
Yeah. To me, the title is a warning, because you feel like the prophet that the ambiguous prophet that you're talking about is the good person in the title. Again, I haven't read it, but that's how I read the title.
Yeah.
And replacing him, it seems like a bad thing. So
Yeah.
you've said a bunch of good things, which is great.
Yeah.
But is that wrong reading into the title? Or?
It's probably an absolute right reading, and probably that's the reason why it didn't sell very well. I think
I'm sorry.
No, because I think that we, and fairly so, we want to be careful of the media that we consume, especially within the evangelical world. We have a long tradition of mistrusting Hollywood, and I think that that's really fair. And I think that another book could be written right along those lines, where you would say, we are taking our cues from the wrong places. We are letting our faith, our beliefs being directed by pop culture and not by God. And that's a huge issue. Ironically, that's not the book that I wrote. So, I think that I could write that book, because I do believe that as well. But, I think the purpose behind it was for me to just sort of think a little bit about God's fingerprints, where we can look at some of these entertainment elements and think about them from a spiritual point of view, to say, we can find some truth and some beauty in some unexpected places.
That's great. What about God on the Streets of Gotham? That one sounds like one of your favorites, I would assume, because you like superheroes so much. Maybe I'm wrong on that. But
no, it was my very first book. And so it's really, it is near and dear to my heart. And really it was trying to sort of unpack Batman from, again, a more spiritual point of view. So I sort of go through the entire history of Batman, but I really concentrate on the Christopher Nolan movies. And the thesis, if I could make a thesis for it, obviously it's not like Batman is a Christ avatar or something like that. He is a dark, brooding figure who probably needs a lot of counseling. But that was sort of what has made him kind of an intriguing figure to me. You have a lot of Christ-like avatars within the world of superheroes, but Batman's just a guy. And he's not a perfect guy. He really has some issues, but he goes out every night to make his world a little better. He has a strict code of conduct, his famous, he's not going to kill. He's not going to be judge, jury, and executioner. He's going to do what he can to make Gotham City a better place. And through all of his failings, through all of his foibles, it's all about trying night after night to make the world a little better. And I think for me, that's one of the things that we're called as Christians to do. We look around our worlds, we see the fallenness in them, we see the hurt, we see the anger. We see all of the sin that we're surrounded by. What is our call as Christians? To be salt and light, to make the world around us a little bit better. And, in our own unique ways. And I think that's something that I take away from Batman.
Yeah, I feel like we could have a whole conversation of superheroes being morally good, and why Captain America is, he will always do the right thing, and, all the different aspects of it. I'm sure you would have a lot to say about that.
Oh, so much. But we'd be sitting here for another hour and a half, so.
I know. Maybe that happens in the future. I don't know. We'll see. But honestly, I'm very thankful for the time that you've given me today, Paul. I really appreciate all of your perspectives on this. You have more wisdom than I will admit that. But thank you for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, no problem. Listeners, make sure you go and follow us on Instagram, YouTube, and join our Discord. We'll have a lot of conversation over there about what Paul said. And until next week, know that you are loved. God bless.